want to welcome everyone to the center. It's very exciting to see such a big crowd. I'm flattered. And of course we have such a beautiful display of dresses that we're so proud of what we have in the costume collection. And the good ladies that are sewing and stitching constantly to do this. And here's a perfect example of the period when I went down there to talk to them about that. And these very eager ladies are sitting down there, and I said, I want dresses from 1911 to the First World War, 1916, and then maybe something from the 1920s. And they said, sure. There we got it. That's part of our 1,000 collection. So that's a good hand for the ladies, because they really work very hard. It's remarkable what's down there. You can see afterwards, and we want you to walk around and look at all these things. It's remarkable the detailings that we have. We have the shoes and the gloves and the purses and the hats and the jackets for the men and the ties and everything else that you possibly could want, so that we're really very, very complete as far as a collection of costumes. Having said all that, I think we should get started with what we're talking about tonight. And of course the connection here is Downton Abbey, that perfectly wonderful English production that they're doing. And sadly, the end of this season, which is going to be next week. I don't know what we're going to do for next month, but for this month we have that. We'll replay all of it again, 1, 2, and 3. I'm told that there is going to be another one, and they're in production, and it should be very exciting. It's so well received in England. I had a friend over here 2 months ago, and they literally stopped everything to watch it. And it really, it's as much part of their lives over there as it has become a part of our lives here. Of course, our collection and our connection with all of this Downton Abbey idea is Frank Forrester. And Frank Forrester, who of course, as you do know, it was a very famous writer, a sports writer, an Englishman who came to this country, born in 1807. He died in 1868, so he was a young man when he died. He'd come over from England, and his family name was Herbert. And when one's looked up, it turns out that he was the grandson of the 2nd Earl of Carnarvon. And of course, the Earls of Carnarvon own a house called Highclere. And so here's Warwick, New York, who has a member of the Warwick group that actually lived in Highclere. And during his period, which was in America in the 1840s, he had written books on hunting and fishing. Very successful writer of his day, so successful that still some of these books are printed. And they're under covers and can be purchased. We have a whole collection of his first editions here, and so we're very proud of those. They're, of course, upstairs in the collection with the archives. But this Frank Forrester, a very interesting man. He had this exceptional background. His grandfather was the 2nd Earl of Carnarvon, and his father, which was the third son of the 2nd Earl. These things got to get this all straight. We have the book, the Burke's Peerage, to prove all this. He was the third son of the 2nd Earl. He had 3 boys. And his third boy was a fellow by the name of Henry. And he, in turn, got himself, we believe, in some kind of trouble. We don't know what it is. They don't talk about it. And there's a wonderful custom in England, and we are told that they're called remittance men when they do this. Excuse me. And a remittance man is someone that's gotten himself into such kind of troubles. Now, we don't know this for sure, but this is what we assume. He's gotten himself into some kind of trouble, so that the family was really fed up. And at that point, they make a decision, and they say, you cannot use the family name, which he didn't. And they have to leave the country. They have to go someplace else, but the family will support you. And he came to this country, and he was very successful sportsman. And so he put it to work. He had this fabulous background. He'd been a product of that Eton, Harrow, Cambridge background, so that he had the most superb English background for education that you could get. But he couldn't use it there, so he used it here, and he used it by becoming a writer. And he was such a successful hunter and fisherman that he was looking for places to go. And in the 1840s, that was the beginning of the great love of the Hudson Valley. The painters came here. Everybody discovered the Hudson Valley. They all knew Connecticut. Everybody knew that side of the river. But not too many people knew this side of the river. And so there was a big push to come here, and he was one of the first in the 1840s, along with the painters, to come to this side. And he discovered Warwick, as they call it, instead of Warwick, as we call it. He discovered Warwick, and he fell in love with it. And he stayed at the old Wawayanda Hotel, which was right directly across the street here, the first white building next to the filling station. The only thing that remains there now is the doorway around the house. That's been saved. And then we have at the 1810 house, we have the original mantle from that building. So the doorway there and the mantle that we have in the collection are the two remaining pieces of the old Wawayanda Hotel, but that was a famous hotel in its day, and Frank Forrester stayed there, and he would come for months at a time, and the owner of the Wawayanda, who was a man weighing 300 pounds and loved to hunt and fish, and he were the best buddies. So they would go off for weeks on these great trips that they would take back up into the hills. And he would write about it. And he was very successful, and he had a very successful writing career. Unfortunately, the career somehow, maybe it was the fashion of the time, maybe it was just that he got tired, somehow or other the whole thing just ran downhill. He married an American girl, he had a child, a boy, which we know nothing about, and then at the end there was a very sad end. It's stated in one book that I read that he gave a dinner party, and no one came to the dinner party. And so he stood up, walked to this great big pier mirror, looked into the mirror, and then blew his brains out. It's a very dramatic end for a very dramatic fellow. Here's a picture of him right here. He was a handsome man of his time, and I'm sure very vibrant. And we're very grateful that he chose Warwick, New York, and we're very grateful that we have all of that for reminiscence and for a background so that we could have a connection with Highclere and Downton Abbey. So tonight, the rest of this hour, I'm going to talk to you about what it's like to spend a weekend in one of these English houses at the turn of the 20th century. Now you've got to remember that this is a world that's it's a world of 100 years ago, and it's a world that's almost gone. We still have bits and pieces of it in Europe, and certainly in England, and very little bits and pieces of it here. But it was a very, very regimented life. And these people that lived in this class had a sense of a direction, and they were trained in a certain mode. And they never left that mode. They never left their circle. They never left their level. And it wasn't a thing to do, as they said. It simply isn't done. And this is absolutely the way they felt. They were raised in this background. They lived this background. Unfortunately, after the Second World War, as you have seen in the series, there's problems ahead. There are graver problems coming on in the 20s and 30s, and then, of course, the Second World War, which really and truly destroyed that whole way of life in the great country house. Now, a house like Highclere, which has approximately 300 rooms and a few thousand acres, and what we see in the production is, unfortunately, because we can only take in so much, is really not exactly what you would have in the great houses of the time. So if we were to take an imaginary trip for the weekend, and we're invited to Highclere, it is now, let's say, as in the story, it's now 1910 or 1911. It's still a part of the history of England before the First World War. And gray clouds are forming over in Europe, but still this whole routine regiment is going on in England. And so you are invited for this weekend, and you start on Friday afternoon, and of course the house is about 90 minutes from London. So you go down from London towards Southampton to this house, and you would probably go down either by train or by car. You've had the invitation sometime the week before, and so you're ready for this. Now, the type of person that would go to these kind of weekends had done this all their lives. So they knew the routine, and there was, believe me, a routine. There was a regimen of what you did, and it was absolutely cut and dried. How you behaved, what you wore, when you came, how long you stayed, what you said, and when you left. and when you left, what you did after you left. So that we'll follow that through. So now it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday afternoon, and our car has brought us down to a house of this caliber, and we have come down there probably in our own chauffeur-driven car with our maid. This is the lady of the house. The husband usually comes down by train a little bit later because he has business in the city. So in this case, she is in the car with the chauffeur and the maid. So already you begin to realize that there are 4 people that are being put up by that one invitation. So that it is the job of the housekeeper and the lady of the manor, in this case the countess, to direct how many people we're going to have for the weekend. If we're having a dozen people for the weekend, we're having a party for a dozen, and then afterwards we're going to have things, we're going to have entertainments and people coming in from the outside, but actually 12 people are invited plus the family. And of course a house as big as Highclere can easily take this amount of people. So we're in the car and we're coming down from London, a 90-minute drive, and we arrive at the house, and the first thing that happens is, of course, the maid is met at the door with the footman and possibly the butler, depending on the person that is arriving. If they are a titled person, of course, the housekeeper and the butler is at the door with the footman. Otherwise, it's the butler at the door and the footman that comes down, opens the car door, and helps the people get out of the car. And immediately the maid takes care of the attention to the luggage, the footman, or one of what they call in those days the hall boys. There's a hall boy, and the hall boy does all the heavy work, because the footman doesn't do heavy work. So that we have the 3 people coming into the house. The maid, the personal maid, gets whatever rooms that are given to her for the weekend for her lady, and then she has her own accommodations, so that they are put in different parts of the house, different quarters. So those people are being set upstairs. In the meantime, the lady of the house is waiting in the drawing room because we're going to have tea. And that's the first part of the reception, that it's a tea. Now, tea at this time, there's at least 5 different kinds of tea. There is tea, then there's afternoon tea, and then there's high tea, and then there's tea in a tent, and then there's a tea fete. So you see there's all these gradations of tea. So as you're coming in on a Friday afternoon, it's a given that it will be tea in the drawing room, which means you're tired, it's a 90-minute drive, and you're in and you're a little bit dusty and you want to go to your room. So you come in for tea, which is probably a brown pottery pot, a plate of brown bread with butter on it, and a welcome from the lady of the house. So it's that simple. That's tea. Now, if you were to have afternoon tea is something that's done between 4 and 5:30, and that has another whole aspect, that the lady of the house is receiving when she's giving afternoon tea. And when she is receiving, that means the house is open between 4 and 5:30, and people come in for this afternoon tea, in which there's a silver service out, and very simple unbuttered bread and plain biscuits, because the ladies who are attending the tea are wearing their good kid gloves. So they can't possibly take the gloves off. They have to sit there and have their little cup of tea, which can be, there's usually 2 types of tea. There's a dark tea, a very heavy tea, or there's a spiced herb tea, so you have your choice. And the lady sits behind the teapot, and she pours either from a black pot tea or from a light pot tea. And you are giving your tea, and you are expected at this afternoon tea, this high tea, you are expected to stay at the most for 30 to 35 minutes, so that you come in and you are received, and if you are attended with a gentleman, he's in there behind you, and at that point you sit down. The gentleman comes in with his top hat, puts his top hat down on the floor with his gloves into the hat. It's all a production. And the lady sits down, she's given her tea, and then it depends on how much tea you want. If you leave the teaspoon in the cup, that means you want another cup of tea. You're going to stay a little bit longer for a little bit of scandal. If you don't want another cup of tea, you put the teaspoon in the saucer. So this with very, very simple cakes or very simple breads. It could be a dark bread or a light bread. That's the high tea in the afternoon. Now, if that same high tea is being done in London, there's probably a little bit more elaboration in a dry, still a dry kind of a cookie, an almond cookie, or some sort of a very dry pastry. Don't forget, we can't take our gloves off. But what happens if the lady of the house isn't there and you do arrive, because the house is open between 4 and 5:30, and she is not there, or you simply want to say that you have presented yourself, but she is not available or you're not available, you sit in your carriage, you take out your personal card, in the upper left-hand corner, you turn the corner down, and you hand it to the footman, who brings it in and presents it to the lady who is receiving a tea. So that it says that you have arrived, that you were there, but for some reason you couldn't come into the house, or possibly the lady of the house wasn't in the house, but you did attend the tea in that afternoon. That's an afternoon tea. A high tea is completely different. A high tea is all the stops are out, all the service is out, the great hot water kettle is out, the 2 and 3 kinds of tea are out, and it's a walkabout tea. It's not a sitting tea. It's one of those things, and no one is more adroit at this than the English, of balancing a cup, a saucer, a cookie, and a teaspoon. I don't know how they do it. And in one hand, and hold their gloves in the other hand, and munch at the same time. They can do it. I don't know. They're trained. I think they're trained from the time that they're 6 years old. However, that's that kind of a high tea with absolutely everything that you can think of, with wonderful sweets, wonderful cakes, gooey cakes, the whole thing. At that point, you take your gloves off and you fold them up, you roll them up and put them in your purse. The gentleman has his gloves and his hat, and you have your tea in very tiny little embroidered napkins, which is one of the things that the daughters of the family learn to do the little embroideries of the crests or the little embroideries of the initials of the family on the little tiny little tea napkins. So that's high formal tea. Now, if you have tea in a tent, this, of course, is a great part of England. They love tea in a tent. Any kind of a fair, any kind of a market, any kind of an open house, there's a tent erected someplace. And there's a great huge table with lots of white mugs and lots of kind of sticky biscuits or sticky buns. And then you go over there, and for a very small amount of money, you can get this very strong tea. In fact, the spoon stands straight up. All right? But this very strong tea is being served in this tea in a tent. And it's part of English country culture. It really is. And it's used for church affairs. It's used for the markets. It's used for open houses. It's used for auctions, for whatever place that you're in, a group like we are tonight. And if it were in the afternoon, there would be a tea tent out someplace to get your tea, because you know the English have to have their tea. And the last of it, of course, is the fete. And that's usually something that's done by the county or done by a church, and sometimes by the great houses, and they'll have booths. And the booths, of course, will have different kinds of food, and they will have different kinds of entertainments. They will have acrobats, and they will have different kinds of bands, depending on what it is. But it's a complete entertainment, very much like what we're going to do this summer when we do an afternoon tea for mothers and daughters. And I hope all of you are going to attend that, because it's going to be a spectacular thing. It's an affair that we're joining with the St. Anthony's Hospital, and the Warwick Historical Society and St. Anthony's Hospital are putting up this huge tent, and we're doing it very much in the Downton Abbey style. So that please, all of you, come to see that the 5th of May, and it's going to be very, very exciting, because we're going to have croquet on the lawn, and there will probably be any number of those kind of very English sort of entertainments. And then, of course, excuse me, there will be a raffle, a very important raffle that we're trying to work on. And if that comes through, it's going to be so exciting. I don't want to let that out right now, but it's something that's really going to be, it's going to knock your socks off. It's really that it is. And so please put down the 5th of May because it's going to be a very exciting thing. Now let's get back to the house. Okay, now we've got the guests upstairs. They're slowly coming in. It's 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And a little tired and dusty. Somehow or other they all get in. They're all accounted for. And they're upstairs. They're down. The lady is downstairs having her tea. The maid is upstairs. So let's go downstairs and upstairs away from the actual members of the entertained, and we'll talk about the people who are doing the work. Now, in the bedroom upstairs, at this time, before the First World War, the system was a piece of paper, just about the size of this piece of paper, that was a very heavy and very elegant stock with the crest of the family on the top or some sort of initials. And that would, in very fine handwriting, that would be prominently displayed on a desk or a table. And that would say Friday, Friday night, Saturday, Saturday morning, Saturday night. You follow what I'm saying. It's a complete rundown of what you're going to do, so no one is ever surprised. So that it will say Friday night, black vest. So you know it was in men's clothing at the time, when you wear evening clothes, if it's formal but not really formal in a sense, a family and friends affair, you would wear your evening clothes with the starched shirt, but the vest underneath would be black silk and the black silk tie. Now, if it's formal, which it will be on Saturday night, then it will say white, because all it says on the card is black. And then next to that, it will say either black or white. And then if it's white, the men will wear the full cutaways, they'll wear the white shirt, the white starch, the stand-up collar, the white tie, and the white piqué vest. So the whole thing is formal. And then next to that, it says jewels and orders. So that you will know that on Saturday night, whatever jewels that you brought, that's the night to wear them. And the gentlemen, for whatever orders they have, if they've done anything in the military or if they've gotten any kind of awards, they wear that for that night. So that the splendid wear is really for Saturday night. And you get the idea that Friday night, you're going to be dressed, but you're not dressed as much. Now, in the meantime, what the lady who has already done this a number of times at this country house, because remember the look of that house, and there are many, many of those houses, they are big and they are cold. They are cold in June, and they are really cold in December, January, and February. And we're at the height of the season now, because the social season is from November to January. And then there's another sub-season that goes from January to March. But the grand things are done between November and the first of the year. And those houses are cold. So you have already registered this, having done this so many times in your life, that you know what to wear for these. You're cold. Those houses are really just this side of being a refrigerator. And the women have already, their dresses have been designed for this, and you are bringing at least 2 complete formal wears for evening. That's Friday night and Saturday night. And you already know that that dining room is damned cold. So you bring things in wool and heavy silks and carry shawls, because there's probably a fire. It's a room not unlike the room we're sitting in right now. And there's a fireplace down there where the sideboard is, and there's a fireplace up here. And it is January, and the house is built of stone. Need I tell you more? You can imagine what the room is like. So the maid is up there. She's adjusting all the clothes that are being prepared. Women figure that it's at least between 3 and 4 changes for this weekend per day. So now, the lady's downstairs having tea, the maid is upstairs, and then downstairs in the kitchen quarters, there's all sorts of chaos going on. Because the kitchen quarters, unlike what you saw in Downton Abbey, because we have to concentrate on the story, it ties it in on the butler and the housekeeper and the cook, rightly so. But they could never manage a house of the scale of Downton Abbey with as small a staff as what we see in the story. Because what you do not see is you never saw the real cook's kitchen. And the cook has her own quarters in the kitchen, her own cooking quarters. And that also is divided between 2 more cooks, because there has to be at least 2 sub-cooks. There has to be one other cook that does nothing but cook for the staff. And the head cook cooks for the dinner parties, the luncheon parties, the picnics, whatever it is that's being served upstairs. But she's not concerned with feeding the masses that are working in the house. Now, just to give you an idea of what happens in a house, you have the butler, and you have the under butler, and then depending on the size of the house, and let's just figure not Downton Abbey, but a house that has 12 to 14 bedrooms, you have to have at least 4 footmen, two secondary footmen and 2 primary footmen, and then you have to have the hall boys, and then you have to have the knife boy, and then you have to have the boot boy. And there are all of these people that are working directly in the house. Now then also you have the maids. You have the upstairs maids, you have the downstairs maids, you have the kitchen maids, then you have the assistant to all of those people in a secondary role who are learning how to do the performance of an upstairs maid. So they're trying to step up. The upstairs maids are really working very hard to become a housekeeper or a cook, as we see in the story. Everybody's trying to step up. This is a period in which class distinction, it's the last of the really important class distinction. After the First World War, it begins to break down. The middle, between the First and the Second World War, they were able to patch a lot of it together. By the end of the Second World War, for the most part, that kind of living was destroyed simply because it changed send the boy to the Army or the Navy, and you're not going to get him back working on the farm. You know the famous old song. And so that it begins to change their thinking, because in the old days, you were born to a certain level. You could not get out of it. You were very lucky if you could get a job in the big house, because that was an opportunity to step yourself up in the serving class, but you could never move out from the serving class to the middle class. There was no way. And the reason there was no way is lack of education. And the minute you opened your mouth, you absolutely nailed yourself to the floor, because however you pronounce your A's or your O's, or how you dotted your T's, told them immediately exactly where you came from in the hierarchy. So that this class distinction in England was so prevalent, so strong at this time that we're talking, before the First World War, that these people, the only chances they had was to get a job in a place like this, or to get a job in an office where that was for only men. But for women and men, it was working in big houses. They could work up, they could learn the language, they could learn better manners, they could get better food, they could get more clothing, because that was all part of what you got. You got 6 pounds a year, 10 pounds a year, and your clothes and your keep. 7 pounds a year, 1905, 1910, that's what you got. And you were very glad to get this, because you really came out of a very, very simple background. And so you were working your way up. We've got them downstairs, and they're beginning to get together for the first dinner of the evening, and that would be the Friday night dinner. At about 5:30, they're upstairs having their tea. The butler is in the dining room. He's setting the table with the first footman, and the cook is downstairs with the undercook and the first and second maids getting the foods together that are going to be handed to the footmen, who take it upstairs, who put it on the sideboard, and then the butler tells people, the serving people, exactly which service is supposed, you see it in the story, which service is supposed to be served at that point. Now, what's happened, and we have a setting here to show you, at this time, at the end of the 19th century, and the beginning of the 20th century, they were changing the old customs in serving food, because England in the 18th century had what we would call farmhouse-style service, in which all the food, this is in the great houses as well as the simple cottages, all the food was put on the table. Now, depending where the house was and what you had to serve it in, you could have it as simple as pottery or as fancy as fine solid silver. But the point was, the actual service of food would be in 3 or 4 stations down the length of the table, depending on how many people would be there for dinner. So that this end of the table would have its soup tureen and 4 platters around it with the vegetables and the meats, and then a footman behind who would help you, to assist you to some of the service from the food in the center of the table. Now, from France, after Napoleon, the defeat of Napoleon, and when the English first, after that debacle in Europe, and the English and the Germans and the Russians got together because they were saying, what are we going to do about getting this thing back on its wheels? And this was in the 1820s and 1830s. They began to see a new way of service. It was called à la Russe. And it was a service the way we know high service today, in which the footman comes around and he has the tray and he serves from the left and takes from the right, and he is gloved and he has the spoons and the knives and the service pieces for you, and he bends over so that you can actually get the pieces. You never leave your position seated at your plate. The plate is removed, another plate is put in, and that is called à la Russe, rather than all this food put on the table. The majority of the food is put on sideboards, it is broken up, and then it is, or pre-broken up, and then it is brought around in its individual service. So in the dining room and downstairs, this is being prepared. The lady is serving tea, people are in there having their cup of tea, and then all of a sudden one of the footmen, you can hear in the distance, what they call the dressing gong. And you hear this bang, 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 which is usually what it is. It's a great big brass disc, and it's got a hammer on it, and it makes this sound. And that alerts everyone that it's somewhere now between 5:30 and 6 o'clock, and you're to go upstairs and you're to get dressed. So now these people who are invited go upstairs, and they go to their rooms, and their valet or their maid are there ready with their clothes that have been taken out. They, in the meantime, have gone downstairs, if need, to a pressing room to press them or to brush them. The English are great for brushing clothes. And so these are all pressed and brushed and ready for you to get into. And you are also invited to have what they call a dressing drink. That's the first of the booze that shows up. And that's right at that point. That's the dressing drink, one. Because when you come downstairs at 7:30, dinner is at 8. When you come down at 7:30, you know you're not going to get anything but a very, very dry sherry. Because the attitude at the time was there was the acidity in wines, and certainly stronger alcohol was not allowed. It just simply, that was something that was drunk later on or before or at another time, but not before the dinner, because it ruins the taste buds. And these people have made an effort to give you a perfectly wonderful dinner. And so with the dressing drink and the people upstairs dressing for dinner, and the people downstairs in the dining room setting the table, we're now ready for the dinner. That first evening is a very casual evening, because that evening allows you to mingle. Now we have 12 people at the table, part of it's family, part of the people invited, possibly someone from the neighborhood. And after that dinner, the ladies excuse themselves. We all know that story. So the ladies retire, and the men sit at the table to have their port, a little bit of port, and then join the ladies. Well, it's interesting, the reason for that, and I don't know how many of you know that. It's at that point in our life, and we're all being very truthful and honest about that, in which we have to use facilities. And so in those days, there was no opportunity, because they didn't have bathrooms the way we know them today, so that the ladies would retire to one of the drawing rooms, where there would be very large screens at one end of the room, with the facilities, the chamber pots behind the screens. And that's the retiring of the ladies to the drawing room. They were given 45 minutes to take care of that problem. In the meantime, the gentlemen were in the dining room, and there was one of two things, depending on where the dining room is situated. If it had good, long French doors that led out onto a terrace or into a garden, you know where the men went. If they didn't, because lots of times these rooms were interior rooms, they would have chamber pots behind a screen. So that it was very well thought out. This was a problem everybody had. How do we handle it? So the men took care of their problems behind the screens in the dining room. The ladies took care of their problems behind the screens in the first drawing room. And then everyone joined together in the second drawing room after the men had their port. Now, in having their port, there's everything has a pattern. Everything. The port is started and it goes clockwise. And it's a one-bottle evening, a two-bottle evening, whatever it is, and that bottle goes around the table. And the men sitting there, and it goes around. It never is supposed to stop. It just keeps going around till the bottle's empty. And the host says it's a one-bottle evening. And so if you've got 6 men, that's a good-sized glass of port after having the full dinner. Now, just before you had your port, a lot of people kept to the old style, and mostly the men, not the ladies. They would have a savory. This I do not understand, but this was absolutely the style. The savory was a dish, usually a cheese dish or a cheese and fish dish, and it was a little piece of toast, and it had toasted cheese and probably anchovies wrapped around it, or it could have little tomato slices, or it could have what they call pigs in blankets, which could be a little sausage with bacon wrapped around. Now you've gone through an 8-course dinner, and you've had the fruit, you've had the dessert, you've done the whole thing with the wine, the white wine, the red wine, the champagne, God knows what. But you have, at the end of all of this, this little plate is brought around, and the men really enjoyed the savory, mostly for the men. And then they had this little, and it really is 3 inches, 2 inches by 2 inches. It's a snack, but it seemed like it was a cherry on the cake for them. That's what they had to have. This is a custom that's long since gone. But you had the savory to finish out the evening. And it was usually something very spicy or highly flavored. So they got through that in a bottle of port, and now everybody ends up in the second drawing room, because the first drawing room has been used for other purposes. And they have an evening, a very quiet evening. Usually guests are invited in, local guests, other members of families, and someone plays the piano or someone does a recitation. There is something very light and simple done, and then they go to bed. So that's the first evening. Now on Saturday morning, breakfast on your card, remember the card, everything is there. You can have breakfast in the dining room, or you can have breakfast in bed. And breakfast in bed was always the same thing. It's just a simple piece of toast and marmalade and tea or coffee. And it was brought in, but it was always brought to the door by the footman. And then it was received by the lady's maid, because he could not come in the room. Now, in the meantime, these bedrooms, remember what I told you about the cold dining room, so you can imagine the bedrooms can't be very much different. Before the people retired, they would have very heavy-duty enameled ware or earthenware, what looked like milk bottles. Think of a great big bottle with a heavy cork end, made out of earthenware or out of heavy metal, and it would be filled with boiling water and then wrapped in a towel. And the lady's maid who had gone down to get one of these would put it in the bed to warm up the bed. In the meantime, the fire would have been started, because all bedrooms had a fireplace. Now the bedroom fireplace, the only one that could put the wood in the fireplace was the footman. There are 2 buttons somewhere in the room, either on the table, or they're in the wall, or there's a bell cord, but there are 2 bell cords. And one is usually very light, so you know that that's a personal bell cord, and one is usually very dark, which is the family bell cord, or the footman's bell cord. And if you wanted any kind of a service from your own personal maid, you pull the white cord or push the white button. And if you needed something from the footman, who could come to the door to tell you this, because only he or the lady's maid could light the fire. And only the fellow that, the hall boy, was the only one that could bring the wood to the room. And the chambermaids were the only ones that could empty the fireplace. So that on Saturday morning, you had to be out of that room by 11 o'clock, because that room had to be cleaned. The ashes had to be cleaned out of there, the room had to be made, fresh linen had to be put on the bed. So from 11 to 12, you had to be out of that bedroom so that they could do their work. But each one of those people jealously guarded their little position. You couldn't ask your chambermaid to light the fire. You'd have to call the footman to do that. Or you couldn't ask the footman to bring some more logs into the room, because the hall boy did that. And each one of these people had a position that they maintained jealously, because that was their little job. And nobody wanted to overstep. And many times, if someone didn't know, you would simply say, well, madam, we'll get that service done. And then they would call the proper person to do it. So now we've got it Saturday morning, we've got the maid taking the tray from the footman, who has already either lit the fire, or the maid has lit the fire, and the hall boy has brought the wood in. So you've got 3 or 4 people running around up there, and we haven't gotten out of bed yet. Anyone that wants to go downstairs in the dining room, there's a full breakfast, and you've seen it very well done in the series, but with all the silver covered dishes, with all the little lights underneath the silver covered dishes. So breakfast is done in there, and then there's the routine for the day. So that there is all these choices that you can have. If it's a shooting day, you can have, and this starts probably at about, you already know it on your card. If it's, you're going for a shooting weekend, and shooting weekend can be quail, it can be pheasant, or it can be skeet. You can do skeet shooting. It's a number of things that you can do, and that's going to fill out the day until between 12 and 1 o'clock. And then it's planned, those people who have gone on the skeet shoot, that's planned for them, rain or shine, that's what you do. And then in the meantime, whoever's left in the house that didn't want to do that, didn't feel up to doing that, there were all sorts of things like puzzles, there were all sorts of things like books to read, all the newspapers to read. There was something that was going to fill up the time. Downstairs, you had to be out of your room, downstairs, and you were in preparation for lunch. Now lunch on one of these shoot days would usually, if the weather permitted, would be outside on the grounds, because these grounds were always so beautifully tended, and they had so many of these outbuildings, and they would have these pavilions, or they would have these ruins, or they would have these kind of exotic little temples, and these things were put to purpose for this. They would have their lunches, they would have their picnics out there, and that of course was a great sight to see. There are a number of films that do this in which you see them going out on a shoot day to do this, and they would end up with the footman and the butler and the linen cloths and the big silver trays and the whole thing way out in the middle of nowhere with a 6-course luncheon. And that was the custom. And then in the afternoon you came back for a slight rest and then started the afternoon with the tea. But for the ladies, there was a new fashion that had come in right at the end of the 1890s. And that was because of Worth of Paris. Worth was the biggest designer of clothes. And Frederick Worth was the one that had designed for the royals, and he was the most fashionable of the artists for clothes. And he had designed a special dress called a tea gown. And we have one of them here, which is this lace dress with the high Edwardian collar. And tea gowns were always very elegant, very lacy, very finely done, costing a fortune. And those were only used for that afternoon tea. And then you kind of swanned around in these beautiful dresses for an hour and a half, and then we got to start the whole thing all over again. The gong comes out, the dressing drink, you run upstairs, the lady's maid is upstairs, she's brushing, the butler's downstairs we're polishing the silver, because only the butler polishes the silver. The butler's the one that's in complete responsible of the silver. Now, we've not talked about the housekeeper. The housekeeper is the single most important person, because she is the one that kind of molds this whole thing together. And as you have seen so well done in the series, that woman has to keep her finger on all sorts of pies, because she has all these things to control. The other thing that is kept is a written commentary on the guests, so that depending on if Lady and Lord so-and-so come, and they have come for 5 years, that there's almost like a diary kept on those people. What they like, what they can eat, what they can't eat, what time she gets up, what time he gets up, what their preference is in wine, what their hobbies are, so that she knows exactly what to do for all those people. And so this kind of script is kept for all these people, and it's a diary. It's a household diary. And between the housekeeper and the butler, who manages and controls all the men, that of course is, as you see in the story, that's a pretty, it's almost a military endeavor what's going on there, because you've got the men in one section and you've got the ladies and the girls in the other section, and they have to be kept separate, because there is always a chance for problems. And it has to do with being beyond what they call the baize door. A baize door is a green felt door, and it's usually studded with brass nails, and it's the end door. You can't go beyond that's the girls' quarters, beyond that's the boys' quarters, so they can't go beyond the baize door. And the control that the butler and the housekeeper have on this group of people. Now, as we see it in the story, there's just a handful. But in a house like Highclere, at one time there was something like 90 in service, 90. So that you would have a series of 15 footmen and another 6 underfootmen. And you would have the butler and the underbutler. This is a military endeavor here.
This is really controlling a group of people. And what we don't see in this story is all the people that have to be cared for by all the other services in the house. Because you have, you know, you have all the services of the dairy. You have all the services in the kitchen. You have the laundry services. You have the woodsman. All these people have a duty to perform that has something to do with the house. And they all have to be fed. They all have to be cared for. Now there's a distinction with those that live in the house and those that service the house. So that there's an under cook whose job it is to warm food, because you have all the people that work in the dairy, that work in the gardens, that live on the property, but don't live in the house. And they bring their food, and they bring their food to the big house, and somebody heats it for them. So their lunch is warm. They have a heated lunch, and they come either with a little pie or a little covered container. But somehow or other they bring a pasty. It can be any kind of a dish, but it's brought to the main house, and there's an undercook whose whole job it is a special oven to keep all this stuff warm. And you can be keeping things warm for 20, 25 people ready for a lunch, which means there's one room which is more or less a common room with little great long tables, and those are all the people from the dairy, those are all the people from the garden, those are all the people. So there's where you start getting 20, 30, 40 people that are being cared for that have nothing to do with those elegant 12 that are upstairs in the main part of the house, but it's all part of the service. So then now as that life is going on downstairs, and they're upstairs with the dressing gong and the dressing drink and getting themselves ready for the second evening, which is the big evening of the weekend. And that, of course, is other people are usually involved. So there can be as many as, let's hope, 24 people for the dinner. And then, of course, it's all grand show, because the ladies wear their jewels and the men wear their orders. And there's usually an entertainment or there's dancing afterwards, but the form is still there. They do the dinner. The men drink the port, the ladies go to the room. Everybody does exactly what they're doing it, but they're doing it in a higher style. And so that night, the Saturday night, is the night that is the most elegant. It's the one in which they show all their finest feathers. Don't forget, this house is still gold, so that there's a certain way of dressing. And the women are wearing heavy velvets and heavy silks. The men for the daytime are wearing the tweeds, and especially if they're doing the shoots, they're doing the heavy wools and the heavy tweeds. Now, if it happens to be a house that is not a house for shooting parties, but if it's a house for hunting parties, then this is another whole bag of tricks, because there's another whole set of uniforms that you wear for that. The men are wearing what they call pinks. A pink is a tailor that started in the 18th century in London, and he was able to cut a very fashionable coat in this peculiar red-pink color that all the men, you've seen all the prints of that, all our lives we've seen those, but that's called a hunting pink. And the hunting pink is worn for the day, which would be the Saturday, and of course if they have a pack, the dogs, on the estate or brought in from another estate, that is one of the most beautiful sights to see, because they all, in a courtyard, they all assemble. And the assembly, the men on the horses with their pink coats, the dogs wandering around, in and around, all the ladies in their wonderful afternoon outfits or their late morning outfits, again, heavy wools, tweeds, heavy silks, lots of furs, almost no jewelry. Very interesting thing about jewelry. Jewelry is worn at night. Almost nothing is worn during the daytime. A wedding band. But it was not the thing to do to start flashing jewelry during the daytime. And the interesting thing is that we see such a great collection of antique earrings and antique necklaces, antique tiaras, and almost no antique diamond rings, because they wore gloves. So it's very hard to put, in a style in the 1920s, they started wearing the rings on the outside of the gloves. But it was not considered a stylish thing to do for the older generation. And certainly at that period, in 1900, 1910, you didn't wear much of anything except earrings and necklaces at night. And during that daytime, maybe a lapel pin, or maybe a little lapel watch and a wedding band. That was enough. But it's another whole series of costumes if they did have a hunting party rather than a shooting party. And then if you had the hunting party, that brought another whole group of men that were working on the estate that would be there, that would do nothing but work for you for the hunt. There's the farrier, there's the stable people, there's the beaters. These would be all the young men and the older men that wanted to make money, that were living in the small houses or the small villages, and they would be assembled, so you'd have 30, 40 of these men with pots and pans and a wooden spoon. And they would make the noise, they would beat the pots and pans so that they would scare the quail or scare whatever the shoot was going to be. They would be held for that purpose. If it was a hunt, then these men would be hired to open gates, because that was the one thing that you needed. You had to have gates open. And everybody was responsible, if they had one of these hunting parties, they were responsible for everybody else's property, because they would do these cross-country runs, and it would be over anybody's fields. They would try to keep on the edge of the fields as they would take across, and they would, sometimes they would have a fox, sometimes they wouldn't have a fox, and they would do what they call a paper chase. And so sometimes they would have a fox's tail that would be tied onto a rope behind the lead horse. And so that would go first, the dogs would go after that, they could scent the smell of the fox, and then of course, whoop, there goes the whole of the hunt. But there were different games that were played with this, but the long and short of it is, they rode the sides of the fields, and this was a full day. And again, at the end of the day, they would all come in, and that would come in, that would never be a luncheon. That would be more of a high tea, because that would bring all the men in dusty and dirty, covered with mud, because anyone that's ridden cross country knows what that's like. You're just a mess. And so that would usually be held in the high hall, in the great hall, as you see in that house, that great hall with the arches, and great big tables would be put out. And then there would be something that would be a little bit more sturdy. There'd be sandwiches and hot tea and whiskey. I mean, where we got the whiskey going now? Because you really needed it. This was a tough 2 or 3 hours cross country. So that these were all the games that would be done on the Saturday afternoon. Then, of course, here we go again. We got the gong. We got the gong. We got the drinking, a little bit more drinking, and then we got dressed for the evening. And so, of course, Saturday evening, as I said, would be this very elaborate dinner service and some sort of entertainment that was usually brought in, or dancing. And then they could have a local orchestra, or they could do it because they were just beginning to come in, and they were very fashionable records, one-sided records. And so they would play those with the needles that would be made out of cactus needles. And so that was very chic. And that was before the steel needle was made. So that would be Sunday night, and Saturday night. And then Sunday morning, one of the first things that was done usually in these houses was a walk to the chapel. There were every estate had a chapel. Every estate had some sort of a religious building on it, and it was part of the fashion to get all dressed up, as you see in the series, for a morning walk to the chapel. Never a ride, always a walk, and that would take you up to lunch, and then you would have lunch. And Sunday would begin to taper down. Sunday would have a full country lunch, and that's where you would have the pies and the meat pies, and you would have the great hams, and you would have the turkeys, and it would be almost what we would call a buffet type lunch, so that the footman would be standing there, the butler would be standing there, they would hand you the plate, and then you would help yourself, very much like a more elaborate service as breakfast was, so that you walked up to the sideboard, you were handed a plate, and then you sat down. So it was much more casual. The chances is the whole weekend is running down. And as it's running down, there's less people in the house. Usually a number of the men would leave because Monday morning they would have to be in the office in the center of London, so that they couldn't be there because so many of these people held these kind of important jobs. So they were out of there. The women would leave later than the next day by 11 o'clock. By 11 o'clock on Monday, everybody was out of that house. And you mostly did not see your host. If you're a very good friend, you would see your host. Never would you see the hostess. And that was just the way it was. But by Tuesday, you better have the thank you note in the mail if you're interested in coming back. And then the other thing that you had to be very concerned with is the pourboire, which is a little bit of monies that would be put in envelopes for whoever took care of you, so that there would be an envelope for the head butler, there would be an envelope for the cook, and an envelope, and then a sum of money for the rest of the thing. It got to be very expensive, but then these were people of means, so that they were used to doing it. So that takes you through a weekend in the country. It's just a lot of work. It really was a lot of work. Everybody worked, whether you were upstairs or downstairs. It was an endeavor. But the thing is that it was so regimented. It was so, you know, cross the T's and dot the I's. Everybody had been trained since little children in that class, and they knew exactly what to do. And so they enjoyed this pattern. They lived for this very set pattern. Now, you want to ask me some questions? No questions?
Yes.
There's a question.
The butler in the show seems to know so much about the table settings and the wines and all that. He learned it as a child?
No, he worked his way up like they all did. He comes out of a very simple background, I'm sure. What do I know? I don't know. But he comes from a simple background and works his way up, probably from a knife boy or a boot boy. When I say knife boy, you know what I'm talking about, or a boot boy. A knife boy, all these knives were, I can't go away from this, carbon steel. And carbon steel rather than stainless steel. Stainless steel came in after the Second World War. But carbon steel stains. If you put vinegar on it, or if you put lemon juice, anything stains it. And to this day, the French will not cut lettuce, because from the old days of cutting lettuce with a carbon steel knife, it stains it. And so he could have started being a knife boy, which was the boy that was hired as a little kid to sit there and scrub with sand and ashes the blades until they got polished again, to get all the stain off. The boot boy was the same thing. Every night he would be given the collection of boots, ladies' shoes and boots, and he would polish them. That would be the lowest job that you had on the estate. Then the next job beyond that would be a hallman, and then beyond that there would be a footman, and then you would work yourself up. And I'm sure that most of those butlers had worked their way up and had learned. And they were bright, and they had learned, and their diction was much better, and they had learned because there were a number of books. Mrs. Beeton, which is a great cookbook of the period, there are other books just like that would give you how does a butler perform, what does the footman do, what does the second footman do, what does the lady's maid do. So that's all been written out, and if you're smart enough to learn it, and you're smart enough to improve yourself, you can, on the next job, you can boost yourself up because you get a good recommendation, and you're working towards being a butler or a valet. A valet was exactly the same thing. You started under footman. And so many of those houses, a lot of men wouldn't bring their own, they didn't have valets. And so there would be one of the footmen, as you see in the story. They would help you with your clothes. Everybody needed help with their clothes. And just talk to our good ladies downstairs. They'll tell you, because the buttons and the hooks, whether it's men's clothes or women's clothes, all of it's the same thing. It's tough to get into. It's all up the back and all up the sides. You can't do it. And then the undergarments for women, because there were 2 or 3 or 4 layers, that you had to be helped into it and helped out of it. So that these were things that these were learned. Now, can I answer anybody else's question? Long-winded. Yeah.
What were the forms of address? I know in Downton Abbey, some of the help are addressed by their first names, and others are addressed by Miss and then their first name.
Depending on as you slowly work, they start usually by calling you your last name, Smith. Then you're just Smith, and you're an undermaid. Or if you're really like Daisy, you're right down at the bottom of the pile. But little by little, then it becomes, if you get a better job, then you can be Miss Smith. Or if you're really, if you're end up, as most of those girls wanted to be a lady's maid, a personal lady's maid, then there would be an interplay, as there is between Lady Mary and Anna. Then they get first name, then she's called Anna. She wouldn't be called anything else but something very personal, because your personal maid is your personal maid. She knows more about you, just like your valet knows more about you than anybody else. There's nothing they don't know. And so there's an intimacy there. And so that has to grow, and it either does grow or doesn't grow.
Was it ever likely that the chauffeur actually married into
You
the
sure,
family? No?
sure,
Okay.
sure, of course. That always happened in love doesn't have a, come on, no. And these things happen. Nobody likes it in that, you remember, you've got the lower classes, you've got the deserving poor. Has anybody heard about the deserving poor? Can you imagine of living in a period where there were literally people that were deserving to be helped, and there were poor that weren't deserving to be helped? But there was a category. They were the deserving poor. So that you were lower class, you were deserving poor, you were middle class, you were the landed gentry, you were the aristocrats, then you were the nobles, and then you were the royals. And all of these fitted, and you couldn't break from the mold. You couldn't, the royals, almost nobody, we see all these stories, there was no way to get to these people. The walls around them were so high and so thick and so tight that there was no entree unless you were a member of the very large royal family, because Victoria had 9 children, and and all of Europe, because she was the grandmother of all the royals in Europe. So the royals were big, a big family. But to get into that clique, you almost couldn't. And to get from being an aristocrat to a noble was a very difficult step, because you could be aristocratic. You could have an old family that had been there since they came over from Normandy. And so that from the Norman invasion, you could have been like the Molyneux family. They came over with the Normans, but that didn't mean necessarily that they were going to be noble. They were just aristocratic, old, rich family. Most of them coming up either from a soldier or a sailor or a farmer that did well or did a service for someone. And did a service for someone that was noble, that they in turn could have them meet a royal that could give them some sort of a title. So that you could start with something as simple as sir, and then you could be the next step up, because you were doing so well at whatever you were doing, you become a viscount, and then after that you would become a baron. I mean, it takes generations to do this. But whatever you did, whatever your service was so good, or they needed you so much, or you were so pretty, or you were so adept at what you were doing, that you worked yourself up. Exactly like the footman that was trying to be a butler. So everybody was on the ladder. Everybody was trying to step up one. And of course, the top of it was to be with the royals. You couldn't get there. You just couldn't get there. There was no way. And that's why at the time of the Prince of Wales, when he married the lady from Baltimore, I mean, that was scandalous. She was a commoner. She was an American on top of that. I mean, my God, you couldn't be worse than that. And so here he was, the noblest of the noble, the prince, marrying a commoner. It was outrageous, just outrageous. Any other questions?
Well, what else did they do Sunday night? If the men were leaving and they had the high tea, they would have no dinner.
No, there was dinner, but it's all simplified, because those dinners were so big. The formal dinners were so big. There was so much food. It was a great period of a lot of food. And English food of that period was not exactly the kind of food that, it wasn't as refined as the food in our better restaurants or our better homes, whether it's in England or France or America or Europe today. It tended to be a little bit heavier. An example of it, we got to set up for the first course here, spoons for soup. And one of the great soups of this period was called Windsor soup. And it was the favorite soup of Queen Victoria. Well, of course, right away that makes it wonderful. Which is, they take great big beef bones with the marrow, and they roast them for 6 hours. And then they scoop the marrow out, and they take the beef bones, and they boil them in a veal broth, all right? And then it's strained twice, 3 times, until you get this absolutely clear beef bouillon. I mean, that's what you're working towards. But this is of a heavy, heavy, rich essence of beef bouillon. And then the marrow was mixed with butter, and sometimes with herbs and spices, and it would be put on little tiny, very thin breads, very flat toasted breads. So you would get the beef marrow, and you would get this very, very rich soup with maybe one little piece of floating lemon in it. And that would be the first course. It was just, it was a heavier palate. It was just, their puddings. Dessert, you'll notice even in the series, they're always talking about the pudding. The pudding is the same, they mean dessert when they're saying pudding. It's just, it's like the word Kleenex. It's just, it's just a word to cover everything that's done in the sweet course. But their favorite of the favorite, of course, was a blancmange or some sort of a boiled pudding. They liked the custard pudding or a floating island, big, heavy desserts with lots of whipped cream on it, and ladies' fingers that have been soaked in rum. I mean, you know, heavy. Any other questions? Yeah.
Would you go through all these silverware?
You have the outer course, if you look at your pictures, the outer course is the soup. And it's true, exactly. Watch the hostess. She'll tell you exactly what happens. You work from the outside in. The first course is the soup. The next course, there's a knife that has a saber-type blade on it. That's the fish knife. And the fish knife and the fish fork, which is the outer fork on that side. So now you've used the fish knife, the fish fork, and the soup. And you're down to the bird course. So this can be pheasant, this can be any kind of a fowl. This is the fowl course. So that's the round-bladed, which came in from France. Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu was the one that started this round-edged blade because too many people were stabbing each other. And they were picking their teeth with it. And he found it disgusting. He was a very elegant man. So he's the one literally that started this round-edged knife. And so this was used for, this is used for this and this, used for the fowl course. And then you have the main meat course with its vegetables, which is the big knife. Now this is one of those carbon knives that stains very easily. And these are the ones that the knife boys would have to scrub, and it was a combination of a fireplace ash and sand in a little wooden box. And they'd sit there and they'd scrub it until it got polished again to get the stains off. But immediately, if this is hit with vinegar or with lemon, it goes to black stains. So that's ugly looking. And then after that, you have your fruit course. And then after that, you have, here's the fruit course, and then you have your pudding course. And then what has to be brought out is, of course, the savory. And that's for the men, which is another small fork like that. And the savory truly is brought out, it looks like a little cracker. It's just about that big. That's the dinner. Of course, and it's heavy dinners. And then we've got it. And the glasses in the plate. Of course, this is the white, the green glass is the white wine. The smaller glass is the red wine. This is the water glass, and then this is the dessert champagne. And then the port wine, the port glass would be brought to the table from the sideboard. The interesting thing about glasses is that the setup of glasses on the table is late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, because in the 18th century, the glasses were all on the sideboard. You'd have to ask for a glass. And then they would put it at your plate. And you'd have one little glass, and the glass would be filled with wine. You'd ask for some more wine, you'd have to go back to the sideboard to get the wine. So bottles were not put on the table. And certainly, never like we do, bottles with labels. Everything had to be decanted. Everything had to be put in a bottle. And the decanting was done for a purpose, because so much of the wine was purchased at another time. And there's always sediment. So that one of the jobs of the butler, and that was his job, with a funnel and a very fine piece of muslin, sometimes 2 pieces of muslin, inside the funnel, they would take the main wine that would come in large bottles, like a magnum, most of the old bottles were big, and then they would pour it very carefully, very slowly through, and usually they would do it with a candle on the other side of the bottle, so they could see the reflection, so they could see if any of the sediment got into, then they had to start all over again, because there would be that much sediment, because Daddy had set the wine down. He'd already purchased the wine in France 30 years ago or 50 years ago, and the way they bottled it at that time wasn't to the perfection that we had learned in the last 100 years. So a lot of it had the sediment, and so it would have to be decanted. And so it was a bottle that came on the table. Never the label bottle from the manufacturer. And then, of course, we had the salt and the pepper, which would be in front of everybody, down the length of the table. The other thing that would be on the table would be flower arrangements, fruit arrangement, and small little compotes of, it could be raisins, it could be nuts, it could be any kind of those little sweet tasting things that you could pick at. Water would be, you'd have to ask for water. You certainly, your wine glass, unless you put your hand across it, the wine glass would be filled. And then lots of times if people didn't drink wine at all, or a white wine, and they only liked the red wine, they'd turn the glass upside down. And then again, as I said to you about the lady, the housekeeper, if she knew you, you'd been to the house for 15 years, and you were an alcoholic, you had a problem, and so she knew it. Everybody knew it, and so they didn't want to cause you inconvenience or trouble or problems. They would see that you would have either a special wine, a small decanter, which would be a colored water. So there would be something would be done so you wouldn't be embarrassed, and you were trying to handle your problem. And the wine is being poured, and everybody's having a good time, and you can't sit there with a glass of water. So that this cranberry juice or raspberry juice or some sort of huckleberry juice, something, would be distilled, and the glass would look as if it were filled with. But care was given to the guests, so that there was all sorts of things that they knew. And they would know that someone was allergic to fish, and so the footman would be told not even to pass that to lady so-and-so, so that it just went right by. Any other questions? Yeah. The china itself is, this is French. This is all Limoges, and it probably dates about 1880, 1890. And the gold is gold. And the same with the service plate over there. The bottles are Waterford, the glasses are Waterford, and the flatware belonged to the Earl of Straight. It's Creston. And his wife was Cora Colgate, and Cora Colgate was married to Samuel Colgate. And Samuel Colgate was the one that founded Colgate Palmolive Bean. They sent the first ships out to get palm olive oil. And then they started making soap, and then they started making linseed oil, and then they went into toothpaste. But they started with the palm olive oil. And then he died, and she had $5 million in 1885. And she decided, like all those stories we've read about the wealthy American that goes to England, and she married the Earl of Strafford. And he was very well connected. He was an aristocrat, he was noble, and he was an earl, and he had, as a little boy, Victoria liked his mother and father very much, so she allowed him as a little boy to carry the pillow with her wedding ring on it. So he was always very close to the royal family, and he married Cora Colgate when he was in his 70s, and it was his second marriage. His first wife died, and so they were happily married, and he had a custom of leaving the estate, going down to the train station and going into London, because he had business in London. And nobody knows what happened, but he fell in front of the train. 6 months after they were married, he was killed by the train. So she became the Dowager Countess, and she lived into the 1930s, and she had one daughter, Adele. And Adele was a rather difficult lady who didn't mix in society very well. And so in her latter years, she built, in the 1930s, she built a house in Tuxedo Park. And she lived there. It was called Hobby House, one of the first big houses as you come into the park. And she lived there until she died in the 1970s.
How did you get the cutlery?
I got the cutlery because I handled the estate. Everything went up for sale. And so I bought some of the things. And so that's the flat where I bought them. Any other questions?
I'm good. Can you tell us why sometimes, like in France, for instance, the forks are on the other side and the British one?
Yeah, yeah. Real custom seeing a fork, as you see in the picture, like that. In Europe, the fork is put down on the table like that from the 18th century because men and women wore lace cuffs. And the forks, the chances of them picking up the lace, either damaging the lace, or the thing would break or fall or cause confusion at the table. So they turn the forks down, and because of that, instead of having the crest on the front, they have the crest on the back. Yeah. There's a reason for everything. All right, would you all like a glass of Prosecco and a strawberry?
Oh, yeah.